there was an incident where some ne'er-do-wells with firearms based on the illicit activity stormed into Secret Boy Films and demanded the money and the illicit materials, and very violently. I was there by myself and was bound with an electric cord and threatened pretty roundly.
You're listening to Comedy Ghost Town, where we investigate why Albuquerque, New Mexico has no designated stand-up comedy club. My name is Sarah Kennedy. Last week, we discussed the ins and outs of the major liquor license options in New Mexico and how they would impact a potential future comedy performance space in Albuquerque. There's a very special type of liquor license that a lot of people discuss as an option when ideating how a club could function around here that we didn't mention last week. It's often brought up because it's one of the cheaper options, and unlike a brewery or winery license, the other options, there's nothing that you'd have to make yourself. As you recall, New Mexico full liquor licenses have historically been sold for around $500,000 in recent years. The option we're diving into today costs interested parties $50 and a $200 application fee. Sounds pretty good, right? The key is that you have to open as a nonprofit private club that serves what the law calls bona fide members and their guests. Is it possible to run a space that puts on comedy shows without being able to publicly call for an audience? Would that be a unique opportunity to have a space like that up and running in Albuquerque? Well, first, before I go any further, I need to confess something. Each episode, I kick off this podcast by stating that Albuquerque is a town without a comedy club, and this is true. Additionally, it's often stated, sometimes even in this podcast, that the last comedy club we had in Albuquerque was Laughs, which closed in 2009. But to borrow some words from actress Dakota Johnson, actually, no, that's not the truth, Ellen. Starting in 2016 and running for about 9 months, Open Source Comedy, a space run as a nonprofit members and guests only club, acted as hosts to a slew of comedy shows featuring performers like Baron Vaughn, Kate Willett, and even Sam Tallent, who you've heard multiple times on this podcast, and you'll definitely hear more from him later. Instead of blandly describing the private club liquor license law to you and letting you contemplate how it might play out, I thought it might be better if you heard the story of Open Source from the guys who ran it, Jason Green and Danger K Varoz. First up is Jason Green.
It's hard to know where to begin a story, right? Anyway, Danger had an office that he was running a film production company out of, and it was called, I believe, Secret Boy Films.
Oh.
Right? And I had just recently moved. My wife and I had just moved from our apartment into her parents, my in-laws' house. And so my living situation had just gotten less than favorable. So I was like, if I had some sort of office or whatever, I started hanging out with Danger at Secret Boy Films. And in addition to being the production studio, there was some illicit activity that I'll let him speak to.
Yeah, let's let him speak to this. Here's Danger.
So Secret Boy Films was my film production company that I opened to launder money that I was making from selling marijuana on the black market to film production personnel in New Mexico. And I was doing this like while working in film and media.
Along with a film production. And it was also a space that, like here in Albuquerque, you contemplate any given space where you could fit about 30 chairs as a potential space to perform comedy. So we were going to start putting on comedy shows out of there. And we had put a lot of planning into like how we could pull that off and where people could park and how that might work. But then there was an incident where some ne'er-do-wells with firearms based on the illicit activity stormed into Secret Boy Films and demanded the money and the illicit materials, and very violently. I was there by myself and was bound with an electric cord and threatened pretty roundly. It was a fairly traumatizing experience.
Okay, so Jason wasn't feeling super safe in the production space up in Nob Hill anymore, and he offered his services to let me find the most bomb location for a comedy club. So Jason found this place on 3rd and Gold, and it was in our budget and it needed some work, and local comedian and entrepreneur Fred Hawks was our landlord, and he was amenable to what we were doing, and he mentioned that he was interested in trying to have a comedy club of his own one day. and so was interested in being the landlord of one in the meantime and feeling it out.
We were like, what we can use this sort of like momentum we have as an illicit uh, purveyor of goods. Maybe we can shut that down to the bare minimum and use it to get this comedy club thing going. And so how could we make that work? How could we make it a self-sustaining thing?
We had an interesting plan for the club because we knew that we probably couldn't have a successful comedy club if people couldn't have a beer or a drink inside. But there was no way we were going to be able to afford a liquor license. So we made the decision to start a nonprofit and opened up thusly, which complicated things for promotion because you can't advertise. I had all this drug money to buy billboards, but I couldn't do it because I wasn't allowed to.
Okay, so I'm going to pop back in here for a second because there are a few things that I can clarify. To qualify for a club license, as the law defines it, you have to be a registered 501c something nonprofit with a board and officers and all that. I didn't personally get into that with Jason and Danger, but I'm sure this was something that they had either taken care of or that they were working on. Additionally, when we're talking about promotion for events, the law explicitly states, this is like the real verbiage from it, a club may advertise a special event for the purposes of soliciting new club members or to notify existing members. Any advertisement, either printed, electronic, or otherwise, must clearly state that the event is restricted to members of the club and their bona fide guests. I like saying bona fide that way. If soliciting new members, the advertisement must state, to become a member, please contact, and then provide contact information of a club member. Examples of special events include, but are not limited to, musical and other artistic performances, speaking engagements, and promotions by commercial entities. And comedy is kind of all of those. So, like I mentioned earlier, and just like Danger just mentioned, traditional marketing was nearly impossible. We do have private members-only clubs in town that do put on special events year-round, including the Albuquerque Social Club, a gay bar that is a major hub for the drag community. Anyway, back to Jason.
And that's what conversation went into it, basically, is maybe this will work. And we came up with this plan by where the comedy community could have this more like a clubhouse, more of a fraternity house or whatever than a comedy club that's at the end of the day all about selling drinks and chicken fingers or whatever.
It worked a little bit. We started building a MailChimp mailing list. Everyone who came in the door, I had a clipboard and I would be like, get on here, even if it was guests, because we had an original, all comics get in for free, have free memberships, and anyone else pays $25 a month for a membership and you come to any show you want. And I thought that was a pretty good deal because if you go to a comedy show, if you're in Denver and you go to Comedy Works, you're going to pay more than that for a ticket for one show and then twice, 3 times as much for alcohol. So I thought it was a pretty good deal. I had a lot of problems getting other local comedians to help support the club.
I don't know exactly where the skepticism, or you'd have to ask somebody else, but it just, people just weren't like throwing down. We had 5 people pitch in money, and I might be undersized. I'm sure it was more than 5 people or whatever, but it was a pretty limited amount of people were actually signing up or whatever. It was pretty clear that it wasn't going to work pretty quickly. So it was just like, these shows are epic. We did have at least just enough people show up to pretty much all of the shows. So there were like 1 or 2 exceptions where it was like, wow, only 9 people showed up or whatever. But for the most part, at least like 20 some people were there, up to like more people than we really should have been fitting in there a few times, which amounts to 60, 65 or whatever. I think maybe even less than that. But anyway, it definitely was at the point where like, oh shit, this is not, even if this is okay with the fire marshal, I'm looking around going, if something crazy happened, this would be iffy. It was no Greg's Comedy Basement. That was genuinely dangerous. I'm a little claustrophobic, and I was freaking out trying to do jokes down there.
Anyway. Woo, woo. Greg's Comedy Basement, shout out. And just to give you listeners some extra context, Open Source and Greg's Comedy Basement had some amount of overlap in their existences. Anyway, back to Danger.
Jason took on the task of booking primarily. So he was able to book really amazing comics from all over the country. And it was really cool because I had the freedom to go on the road. So I was able to capitalize on these relationships. I was able to, hook Kate Willett up with the show and then go open for her in Denver. And it was really good for my own personal comedy career. It didn't do anything for Albuquerque comedy because we ultimately failed to keep the club open. And there was talk when we closed it down of relocating and downsizing and downscaling, and we ultimately ended up not doing any of that stuff. And honestly, like in retrospect, I made a huge mistake by being so emotionally invested in the club, because I took it really personally when we would have big shows with big people coming from out of town. When we had Baron Vaughn there, and we just couldn't get local comics to care.
On top of membership issues, there's a lot of liability that comes with a place full of other humans.
It's like, what are we even, if we're going to put up a sort of fight to make this thing happen, what are we even like trying to make work here? I don't want to, eventually there's going to be some crazy drunken brawl or whatever. Do we really want that? Insurance and all this kind of stuff got to be a little expensive if we wanted to have like real insurance against those kinds of things. We basically had to have like business insurance and stuff like that I wasn't really directly involved with, so I don't really remember. But there's definitely like halfway through that at best, it was clear like this isn't really going to work out long term, but we are stuck in this lease. So let's just have a bunch of fun comedy shows and call it good and try not to spend any more money on this. So when it became time to take certain next steps that were going to mean like big investments, it was like, we're just not going to do that. So as far as the cost to keep it going and everything like that, it would have been a little bit more expensive than I thought, I think, because of things like insurance and whatever, and the real type of insurance that one should have, considering that you're inviting a bunch of potentially inebriated people into an environment that you by design want to like flirt with the border of control. You know what I mean? Like there is a lot of responsibility that you're taking on that you don't really think of until you're responsible for a whole room full of people. At the end of the day, it was a super cool like series of shows, because we just booked our favorite sort of comedians that were regionally within reach on some level, and then the ones that we liked out of that, or that we were close enough to that they would do it for very little money. But we did pay everybody, and it was a reasonable amount of money.
So it went from we booked Sam Tallent to come headline in I think July or August or something like that, and by the time he came, we were like, hey Sam, this is our last show. So he came and did closing night, which was like one of the biggest parties, like combination comedy show party I've ever experienced in my life. It was very fun.
You performed on the last night when Open Source was closing down.
Yeah.
Did you know that it was the last night, and what was that show like?
I don't think I knew it was the last night until I was there that weekend, maybe the week before I found out. And I remember that he wanted the last show to be like a send-off for Albuquerque comedy in general. And he was like, okay, I'm going to put up like 20 people, and then you go up and close the show. And I was like, hey, much better idea. Let me host the show. So that way people who did come to see me get more of me before they're exhausted from 20 comedians of different calibers of performance, to put it in a kind way. So yeah, I was like, yo, Danger, let me get up there and host. And that way I can say, hey, this is my friend Jason Green, who I've known forever. And I'm really glad that I got to be down here. Bring up Rusty Rutherford or make fun of Rusty Rutherford or whoever it may have been. And it became a lot more personal and fun because I've been coming down there for 12 or 13 years now. And it was just cool because I got to tell old stories about these people and also not have to go up at the end of a very long show. And also there was probably 12 people there for the show. Like, I don't think it was packed out. Luckily, all the comics there filled in the crowd and were supportive and were excited and cheered each other on. But God, I hate going up after 3 people. Going up after 20 is just a nightmare. But it was special. It was fun. And I'm glad that I was there for it, of that very small part of the history of Albuquerque comedy.
I think what Sam says there is a great point. It was special. Maybe for Jason and Danger, it was a nightmare at times, but open source comedy was a part of Albuquerque comedy history. And maybe, like good open source software, it can create the framework for what comes next. If the next founders of a club in Albuquerque want to go down the route of opening up as a members-only club, while they won't be the first to try it, they will be the sole privately run club in the country and possibly the world. And that's definitely something that would make it stand out, / hopefully stand the test of time. This has been Comedy Ghost Town, produced and hosted by comedian Sarah Kennedy. If you'd like to find out more information about the podcast or me, you can find out more at my website, sarahkennedy.com/comedyghosttown.